Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Continual Improvement webinar on What's New in Quality and Regulatory 2023. This is Sierra Tollefson, an education specialist for Mayo Clinic Laboratories. Our presenters today are Shannon Bennett, Director of Regulatory Affairs in the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology, Quality Management Services, and Jennifer Nosbish, CLIA Compliance Program Manager in the Integrity and Compliance Office at Mayo Clinic, both in Rochester, Minnesota. Just a couple of things to remind everyone of before we begin today. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the program. You can submit any questions online via the Q&A icon in Zoom. Please only use the chat function for any technical issues. Today's program is being recorded and will be posted to our website in a few weeks. And now I'll turn things over to our presenters.
Good morning, and thanks for joining us today, or good afternoon, or maybe even good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Today's learning objectives are to identify the top CLIA deficiencies in 2022. Actually, the data is probably from 2021 from CMS, but I also pulled data from accrediting organizations, and that's from 2022. The second objective is to adapt remote review requirements to your practice. The third learning objective is to advocate for laboratory reimbursement reform. And the fourth learning objective is to examine potential implications of LDT regulations as medical devices. So let's jump right in with CLIA deficiencies. CMS actually publishes two lists. One is the top 10 deficiencies in the nation, and the other is the top 10 conditions in the nation. And so CMS may impose what's called alternative sanctions in lieu of or in addition to principal sanctions when a condition level requirement is not being met. So if the lab is out of compliance, the lab will receive what's called a condition level deficiency. And you can tell the difference in the actual regulation, the CLIA regulation. So for instance, 493.1236 actually says 493.1236 standard evaluation of proficiency testing performance. So that is just a standard that would be on the deficiency top 10 list. Whereas 493.803 says condition after it. So it says 493.803 condition, successful participation, referring to PT. So if that one was on the top 10 list, that would fall underneath the condition list. And so what I did today is I looked at both of those lists to really look at what those top deficiencies are. And so really we're going to look at top 15 lists. So next slide. The deficiency coming in number one happens to come off of that condition list. And that is 493.803 condition successful participation. And that's really referring to PT, proficiency testing. And that is that each laboratory performing non-wave testing has to successfully participate in a proficiency testing program approved by CMS, if it's applicable, as described in subpart I. The deficiency rate for this requirement is actually at 22.85%. So it's a very high deficiency rate, thus bringing it in at number one for us. Interesting fact, when I looked across 4 different accrediting organizations. So hopefully one of these is ones that one of your accrediting organizations, and this can kind of help you a little bit. But when I looked across 4, I looked across CAP, the Joint Commission, A2LA, and COLA. When I looked across those, it was not on the top 10 list for CAP, Joint Commission, or A2LA, was not on those lists. But it did come in at number 9 on the 2022 COLA most frequent citation list. Coming in at number 2 is standard 493.1235 regarding personnel competency assessment policies. So as specified in the personnel requirements in subpart M, the lab must establish and follow written policies and procedures to assess employee and, if applicable, consultant competency. This has a deficiency rate of just under 19%. So again, pretty high. When I looked across those, looked at those accreditation organizations, this one came in for CAP at the number 1. So pretty darn close to the CLIA one. Joint Commission has an HR.01.0601 EP 18, and that came in at number 4 on the list. COLA, it came in at number 1 deficiency to complete competency assessments. That is PER 5 for COLA, for those with COLA. And for A2LA, it came in at number 1 as well. So again, pretty darn close. Two to 1s pretty much on that one. Coming in at number 3 on the list, again, is another condition level. So if we only would have looked at the deficiencies, we would have missed the top 2 out of 3 already. So coming in at number 3 is the second condition level, and this is 493.1403. And this one is for laboratories performing moderate complexity testing, and it's related to the laboratory director. And this one states that the lab must have a director who meets the qualification requirements and provides overall management and direction. So it relates to the qualifications of your lab director. You need to qualify those lab directors. This one has a pretty high deficiency rate as well of 18.2% of all labs that were surveyed had this deficiency rate. So a pretty high deficiency rate on this one as well. It was not in the top 10 for CAP, Joint Commission, A2LA, or COLA. Number 3 was not in those accreditations top 10 at all. Coming in at number 4 on our list today is CLIA Regulation 493.1252. And B, it's part B of that regulation specifically. And that is that the laboratory must define criteria for the conditions that are essential for proper storage of reagents and specimens, accurate and reliable test system operation, and test result reporting. That criteria must be consistent with the manufacturer's instructions if provided, and the conditions must be monitored and documented. And so this includes such things as your water quality, your temperature, your humidity, your protection of equipment and instruments from fluctuations and interruptions in electrical current that adversely affect patient test results and test results. This one, we had a deficiency rate of 17.5%. And when I took a look at what those accreditation organizations looked like for CAP, not all of the components were in the top 10, but part of the components were. So at COM.30750 states the lab must monitors and records temperatures using a calibrated thermometer. So that part was in there, and that came in at number 9 on the CAP list. When I looked at the Joint Commission, it was not in the top 10. COLA, it was not in the top 10. When I looked at A2LA, it came in at both number 6 and number 7. And let me explain that a little bit. So A2LA splits 1252B into 2 different requirements. So this one's probably one you want to pay a little, pretty close attention to, because it does hit those things, and it covers quite a bit in there, quite a bit in that one section of a requirement for this one. Coming in at number 5 is again one of those standard requirements. So this is at number 5 is 493.1236, specifically C1. This requirement says that at least twice annually, the lab must verify the accuracy of the following. So any test or procedure it performs that is not included in subpart I. And so this one, the deficiency rate is pretty high. Again, it's at 16.27% of all surveys. And so this one, interesting, even though it's number 5 on the CLIA list, it did not hit any of the accreditation lists of the top 10 accreditation lists in 2022. Not CAP, Joint Commission, COLA, or A2LA. So fun fact on that one, I guess. Coming in at number 6 on the top list here is 493.1253B1, specifically about verification of performance specifications. So this one states that each laboratory that introduces an unmodified, FDA cleared or approved test system must demonstrate that it can obtain performance specifications comparable to those established by the manufacturer. Deficiency rate is just under 16%, and it was not in the top 10 either with any of those. CAP, Joint Commission, COLA, or A2LA did not make the top 10 in any of those. And coming in at number 7 for CLIA is 493.1251B, which covers procedure manual. And really it says the procedure manual must include the requirements for specimen acceptability, microscopic examination, step-by-step performance of the procedure, and preparations of materials for testing. This one comes in just at the deficiency rate of 14.63%, so just under that 15% deficiency rate. And for CAP, it did not make the top 10 list, but the requirement to have a procedure manual did come in at number 4. Joint Commission didn't make the top list for Joint Commission or COLA, but A2LA, it did come in at top 4. Which states, it kind of gets this is where it gets a little fuzzy comparing accreditation to CLIA list, because it's almost like comparing apples to oranges. So it makes it a little fuzzy, or apples to oranges to pears to bananas, I guess, comparing all of those, because they're not one for one, as you probably can imagine. But like for A2LA on this one, it comes in at number 4 on the list. But what really comes in is it states the procedure manual must include corrective action to take when calibrations or control results fail to meet the lab's criteria. So not really the same, but kind of. It's kind of getting there, but kind of different too. So take that for what it's worth, I guess. Coming in at number 8, again, is also on procedure manuals. And so that is 493.1251A. And this one states that a written procedure manual for all tests, assays, and examinations performed by the lab must be available and followed by the lab personnel. So this one has a deficiency rate of just under that 15%, 14.57%. For CAP, this one came in at number 4 on the CAP list. Did not come in on the radar for Joint Commission or COLA. And for A2LA, it came in on number 3 on their list. Moving right along to number 9. Maintenance is at number 9. So 493.1254A1 is maintenance as defined by the manufacturer, and with at least the frequency specified by the manufacturer, has a deficiency rate of 13%. And for CAP, it was number 6 for CAP. And that happens to be COM-30600. And for Joint Commission, it's also number 6 for them as well. And that happens to be Environment of Care, the EP7. Did not make the COLA list. And for A2LA, it came in at number 9 as well. And at number 10, rounding out number 10 here, rounding out the top 10 here is 493.1252D, letter D, which covers reagents, solutions, culture media, control materials, calibration materials, and other supplies must not be used when they have exceeded their expiration date, have deteriorated, or are of substandard quality. It has that deficiency rate just under 13% at 12.9%. It did not make the top list for CAP, Joint Commission, or COLA, but it did come in at number 8 on the A2LA list. All right, so 11, we're gonna jump to number 11 now. At number 11, with a deficiency rate of 11.67%, just under that 12%, is 493.1291, a letter C, or little c, which lists out the information required on a test report. Quite a list on what's required on that test report. This did not make the top 10 list for any of the accreditations agencies I looked at. At number 12, with a deficiency rate of just over 10%, 10.12 or 10.24%, is 493.1407 E4I, addressing the lab director's responsibilities to ensure the lab is enrolled in an HHS, Health and Human Services, approved proficiency testing program for the testing performed, and that the proficiency testing samples are tested as required. This one comes in at number 2 with COLA, and the lab director fulfills the PT responsibilities of the position. That's how it's stated for COLA, but it did not make any of the other lists. And at number 13, this is where we see another one of those condition level deficiencies. With a deficiency rate of just under that 10% is 493.1250. And this is the third condition level that we've seen now. And this requirement is for labs performing non-wave testing. They must monitor and evaluate the overall quality of the analytical systems and correct identified problems. So pretty big requirement, pretty big umbrella there. And it was not on any of the 4 accredited agencies' top 10 lists at all. At number 14 is another condition level with a deficiency rate of 4.56%. And this one's related to high complexity lab directors. And this one is that the lab must have a director who meets the qualification requirements and provides overall management and direction. And this one, again, did not fall on any of the 4 accreditation lists at all. And rounding out the top 15 is another condition level deficiency with a deficient rate of just over 7. And that is 493.1100 and regarding facility administration. And this really relates to having adequate space, lighting, water quality, following applicable state and local laws, those types of things. And this one did not fall on any of the lists either. And so I think a big takeaway here is that of those condition level requirements, a lot of them were, so we saw a total, I think, of 5 out of here. Most of them, 3 of them were in 11 through 15. We saw a couple of them in those top 10. Yeah, of the top 15 we had, 5 of them were condition level. And there was a big difference between what CMS had, deficiency list, and the accreditation agencies had. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shannon. Shannon, we did miss the disclosure slide.
Flip through it fairly quickly, but
okay, perfect.
We can circle back to that if necessary.
Okay.
So thanks, Jenny. It's always helpful to understand what other laboratories are getting cited for so that we can avoid those same citations in our lab. So thanks for presenting that list. My first topic today is on performing laboratory work remotely. And largely what I'm talking about here is someone in their home office reviewing digital laboratory data or digital images from the laboratory. So prior to the COVID public health emergency, if someone wanted to work from their home office doing digital data review, they would require a CLIA certificate for their home, basically. As far as CMS was concerned, their home is a laboratory. And that creates a couple of challenges. First of all, a CLIA certificate requires a laboratory director, and a given laboratory director can only have 5 CLIA certificates in their name. So if you have a smaller laboratory with only a handful of people who qualify as CLIA lab directors, and a bunch of your staff want to work remotely, you're going to run out of CLIA lab directors pretty quickly. In addition, CMS requires that a quote-unquote laboratory, so a facility that has a CLIA certificate, needs to be inspected periodically. And so this created the situation where you'd have an inspector come in the front door, walk through the living room, past the kitchen, and into the home office laboratory that consisted of a desk and a computer. So that provided some obvious challenges. And then finally, typically, these home offices are affiliated with a primary laboratory using all of their procedures and processes and policies. However, when one of these home CLIA sites would get inspected, the inspector would be looking at it as an independent laboratory and be reviewing the full quality system, which is very duplicative because the primary laboratory would also have the same quality system reviewed during their inspection. So it created a lot of redundancy. Then COVID came along, and CMS recognized the value of trying to get people as far apart as possible. So they released this memo, QSO 2021 CLIA, that allowed for remote slide review, remote data review, and temporary testing sites without the need for applying for a separate CLIA certificate. So it was essentially using enforcement discretion to allow people to do this remote work without getting a CLIA certificate. So fast forward to today, on the last day of the PHE, which was in May, literally the last day, CMS released another memo stating that they would use continued enforcement discretion post-PHE, meaning that staff could continue reviewing digital data remotely without a CLIA certificate. So that was a very positive thing. That home office would need to be affiliated with a CLIA certified primary lab, of course, and they would need to operate under the same specialties that the primary lab operated under. So this wasn't a loophole to allow laboratories to add specialties to their CLIA certificate without adding specialties to their CLIA certificate. Now, CMS does have a number of requirements to be able to do this, however. So first of all, if any portion of the testing process occurs at a remote site, so someone's home, there needs to be a performing site message on the patient report stating part of this test was performed at location and then the address of the remote site. Thankfully, CMS is allowing the use of a code because I don't think it's ideal to have our employees' home addresses on patient reports. So we can use a code that is traceable to that employee's address. So if I'm performing remote review, I would add a code saying part of this test was performed at location X324. And then that code would be traceable to my actual address. And so along those lines, labs are also required to keep a list of staff working remotely. And that's probably the place where you want to then crosswalk the code with the address. So the good news is we can continue having staff work remotely as long as we use the performing site message and maintain a list of remote staff. I will note this is enforcement discretion. So hypothetically, CMS could remove this at any time. However, they did put out a request for information earlier this summer, and it sounds like CMS is looking to make this permanent in some fashion, whether that be updating CLIA or through some other mechanism. But that is definitely good news for laboratories. Next, let's talk about laboratory reimbursement, because we all like getting paid. In this context, salsa is not a delicious snack, but is actually a piece of legislation called the Saving Access to Laboratory Services Act. So salsa actually seeks to address a problem with another piece of legislation, PAMA, or the Protecting Access to Medicare Act. So one of the things that PAMA sought to do was to reduce the costs that or reduce the reimbursement that the government pays for laboratory testing. Government likes saving money. And so the plan was to take a look at the cost of tests across the country, find an average, and that becomes the new rate that CMS would reimburse. Makes sense. The problem is that CMS decided to collect data only from the largest laboratories. And so this would be like using Amazon to price the cost of hammers and not take into account your local hardware store. Large laboratories have economies of scale, and so their price per test can be lower compared to a local physician office lab or a small laboratory supporting a nursing home or things like that. And so based upon this pricing mechanism, many tests could have faced up to a 15% cut in reimbursement. And that's in one year. That could continue going down over time. So that's obviously a huge hit. Now, thankfully, Congress has continued to delay implementation of these, but SALSA seeks to be a permanent fix to the math behind PAMA, basically. So there are three main components of SALSA. The first is representative sampling, and both of those words are important here. So representative, we want to get data from all sectors of the laboratory industry. So not only the large independent laboratories, but also hospital laboratories and physician office labs, so that we get a true average or true understanding of the range of prices a given test or given analyte might have. And then the sampling piece. So under PAMA, laboratories would need to provide significant data around their pricing. And that becomes a very significant administrative burden for laboratories. There were some laboratories that were eligible to provide data that perhaps chose not to, just because the amount of work and resources it would take were too great. So SALSA allows for a sampling approach instead to set these prices. SALSA also adjusts the frequency of data collection. Under PAMA, it's every 3 years. SALSA would make it every 4, again, to reduce that administrative burden of collecting all of this data. It would give laboratories more time. And then finally, SALSA would provide some guardrails on how much rates could change year to year, plus or minus 5%. Under PAMA, for some tests, it would be plus or minus 15, so much greater potential cut. And in some circumstances, there was no limit. So tests could be cut by any amount. Again, that's not sustainable. So SALSA would reduce the administrative burden on laboratories, get a better picture of the laboratory industry as a whole, and allow more stability in pricing structure that laboratories could plan for, essentially. So SALSA right now is in the gathering co-sponsors stage in Congress. And so if your laboratory was going to advocate, this is one of those times where you would want to go talk to your local representatives. I will say that SALSA does face a bit of an uphill climb, and the reason for that is it seeks to reduce reimbursement cuts, which by definition means it adds cost. And the government doesn't like spending additional money in many cases. I've seen some estimates that SALSA would cost an additional $2 billion over 10 years. There's another estimate that would cost $4 billion over 10 years. So that's a significant amount of money. But it is absolutely critical for laboratories that we not face these really draconian cuts, because that obviously would be very disruptive to what we do. My final topic then is around FDA regulation of laboratory developed tests. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. So just by way of background, the group likely already knows. So the FDA regulates in vitro diagnostic test kits. So these are the test kits you buy from your favorite test kit manufacturer, and they regulate those as medical devices. So IVD manufacturers need to submit validation data to the FDA, receive approval before they can sell their kits to laboratories. On the other hand, FDA largely does not regulate LDTs. And so there's two regulatory schemes based upon whether the test is an LDT or an IVD. So FDA's interest in LDTs is not new. It's about 10 years old, actually. So in 2014, FDA drafted a guidance document, Framework for Regulatory Oversight of LDTs. And in this guidance, they essentially proposed that they would treat LDTs as medical devices. So just like IVDs, pacemakers, hip implants, and so on. As you can imagine, there was a tremendous amount of pushback from the industry, and the FDA ended up never finalizing this guidance. The draft is still available on the web if you care to go look for it, but this never went into effect. Instead, FDA changed direction, and instead, in 2017, they published a discussion paper, a white paper on conceptually how they might regulate LDTs. And there's a lot of conversation generated by this. Interested stakeholders provided their input. And this eventually turned into a piece of draft legislation called the VALID Act. So this is the Verifying Accurate Leading Edge IVCT Development Act. And the main point of VALID is it would put IVD test kits and LDTs under the same regulatory umbrella, the same regulatory model. And it would create this new class of products for the FDA called in vitro clinical tests, or IVCTs. So IVD test kits would no longer be medical devices, they would be IVCTs, and LDTs would as well. So based on this discussion draft, there's a lot of conversation between the agency and Congress and stakeholders, and that the VALID Act was finally introduced in March of 2020. Now, importantly, VALID had a Democratic and Republican co-sponsor in both the House and the Senate. So it was both bicameral and bipartisan. And that really is necessary to give it the best chance of moving forward. Unfortunately for VALID, that early March, April timeframe in 2020, we were all a little preoccupied with COVID. And so VALID didn't go anywhere in Congress. However, there was a lot of discussion behind the scenes between FDA, Congress, and stakeholders. And last summer, the VALID Act was reintroduced in both the House and the Senate. And the good news is that it was significantly changed from the 2020 version. So clearly Congress had listened to a lot of the feedback, particularly from the lab industry. And while VALID still had issues, it was certainly better in the 2022 version than in the 2020 version. Now, last year was an important year because we had something that is called a legislative vehicle. So VALID is very unlikely to pass on its own as a standalone bill. It's just too small and too niche. So it would most likely be attached to another larger piece of legislation or legislative vehicle. Last year, there happened to be a must-pass FDA funding bill that would be voted on in October. And so VALID was introduced in late June, early July, and everyone thought VALID would be included in this FDA funding bill in October, up until literally the 11th hour when VALID was stripped out and that funding bill passed without it. Well, thankfully for VALID, there was another opportunity, the omnibus spending bill at the end of the year. So again, VALID was destined to be attached to that legislation, and at the 11th hour, it was stripped out. So Valid had 2 shots last year and it failed at both of them. So Valid was not enacted. So where does that leave us this year? So Valid has been reintroduced in the House, but it has not been reintroduced in the Senate. And one of the major reasons for that is that the Senate Republican co-sponsor, Senator Richard Burr from North Carolina, has retired. And advocates have not been able to find another Republican co-sponsor. So it has not been reintroduced in the Senate. And if I were a betting person, I would say Valid probably has pretty dim prospects this year. With next year being a presidential election, I think it's also unlikely to go anywhere next year. So Valid is still in the discussion, but I don't think we're going to be seeing that in any meaningful way anytime soon. So where does that leave us? Let's take a step back and talk about the 3 mechanisms FDA has to gain additional authority. So first and foremost, we have legislation. So like the Valid Act. The agency, Congress, and stakeholders get together and come up with a new law granting FDA additional authority. This is probably the strongest approach because it literally has the force of law behind it, but Valid failed. So doesn't appear to be an open option. On the other end of the scale, we've got guidance documents. So this is a guidance that FDA writes themselves. However, they are not legally binding. There's a disclaimer at the beginning of each of FDA's guidance documents that says something along the lines of, this document is not legally binding. It just represents FDA's current thinking on whatever the topic of interest might be. So guidance is an option, but it is a weaker option. So the third way then is regulation. This is where, again, FDA drafts new rules, but they use a process called notice and comment rulemaking, where the regulations are published in draft. The public has an opportunity to provide comments, things they like, things they don't like, things they think should be included or excluded, and FDA needs to review all of those comments. They don't need to accept them, but they do need to review them. And so rulemaking tends to be a fairly lengthy process. And so regulations are where we find ourselves with now. So FDA signaled that they wanted to have draft LDT regulations published on August 31st. We've obviously missed that. But these regulations do exist. So they're at the White House right now for final review, and that is the final step prior to publication. So I would expect to see draft regulations published on FDA regulation of LDTs probably by the end of the month, if I were to guess. So what are some key concepts we could pull out of the Valid Act? And that's relevant because these are concepts that could show up in potential FDA regulations as well. So let's talk about some of those concepts. The first is grandfathering. So no one knows how many LDTs are on the market today because there's no centralized repository for that information. I think 100,000 is probably a reasonable place to start, but it could very easily be more than that. There's no way with their current resources that FDA could review all of the existing LDTs on the market, to say nothing of the new ones that come on the market afterwards. So there has to be, or there could be, I should say, some mechanism for grandfathering existing tests, or in some fashion prioritizing what FDA is going to look at. I think it's very likely we'll see a risk-based submissions process. So FDA uses a tiered submission process for medical devices today, and Valid had one as well: low risk, moderate risk, high risk. Low risk tests are those where the risk of an inaccurate result has a minimal impact on patient safety. High risk means that there is a high risk to the patient in case of an inaccurate result, and then moderate risk fits somewhere in the middle. Low risk tests under Valid did not require any submission at all. Moderate and high did, and the amount of documentation and evidence required went up as the risk level went up. Now, importantly, Valid did include some exemptions from submission, and I think the most important one was called the humanitarian use exemption, which is a weird name. It's basically a rare disease exemption. So under Valid, if you have a test for a disease or condition that affects fewer than 10,000 people per year, you did not need to submit to the FDA. So that's why I think of this as a rare disease exemption, which is good because the benefits to the laboratory of developing rare disease tests are already fairly limited because they tend to be low volume, reimbursement tends to be poor. We don't want to add yet another roadblock on labs developing these really, really important tests. So I think some sort of rare disease exemption is something we definitely want to advocate for. Modifications was an area of significant discussion. So in the early versions of VALID, essentially any change you made to a test would require an FDA submission. And so I know many stakeholders, myself included, advocated to the FDA that that is nonsensical. The laboratories are always looking for ways to make their tests more accurate, more efficient, faster turnaround time, lower sample volume. Tests need care and feeding. And so in the latter versions of VALID, it was really only significant changes that impacted the performance characteristics of the test or added a new intended use would require a submission. So minor, quote unquote, minor modifications, instead of adding 5 milliliters of reagent, I'm going to add 3. So that cuts down on the cost of the test. Those sorts of things would not require a submission to the FDA. Technology certification was a really interesting concept. I liken this to a center of excellence model where a laboratory could submit an example test to the FDA on a particular technology, along with additional information on their quality system and other supporting documentation. And if FDA granted that tech cert, the laboratory could then implement as many tests under that technology that they wanted to without needing to submit to the FDA. So if I got a tech cert, for example, on mass spec testing, once approved, I could then develop and implement as many mass spec tests or modify existing mass spec tests as I wanted to, and would not need to submit to the FDA as a center of excellence for mass spec testing. So I think that's a really nice concept to reduce the submission burden, both on lab and on the FDA, honestly. So hopefully we'll see that similar concept in any future regulation. We'll see. There is a registration and listing component. So as I said, today we don't have a central repository for the number of LDTs in the market. This would solve that problem. Essentially, laboratories would need to submit information on their tests, and not just new tests, but also grandfathered tests. So that's an important point, is grandfathering isn't a get out of jail free card. There are still some responsibilities labs would have for their grandfathered tests, including registration and listing. Now, what components go into that listing has been a source of contention. I think laboratories would advocate for a minimal amount of information due, again, to administrative burden. FDA in the early versions of VALID wanted like details on your performance characteristics, for example. So what's your accuracy, what's your precision, how many samples did you run for those studies? Very expansive information. So I think it's very likely that FDA will require registration and listing for LDTs should they have greater authority over regulating them. The devil will be in the details on how much information they will expect. FDA certainly will be interested in adverse events. So if there is a problem with your test, and certainly if it caused or potentially caused patient harm, FDA will expect a report on that. This becomes a little challenging for laboratories because a lot of adverse events are more so on the lab operations side versus the design and validation of the test side. There are certainly some events due to a flaw in how a test was developed, but a lot of times it's really operator error or a bad lot of reagents or whatever the case might be. And so this is one to watch very carefully on as well to make sure that laboratories aren't forced to submit a bunch of adverse events that really fall more on the CLIA side of things, lab operations, than on the FDA side of things, the development and validation of an LDT. And then finally, a transition period. One thing that, again, I've personally stressed to the FDA is, by and large, labs don't speak FDA, right? So there's going to need to be a significant amount of education for lab as well as for FDA. FDA doesn't necessarily speak clinical lab either. So really coming to a common understanding of requirements and how labs function and those sorts of things would be really important. So transition period could be all over the map. When FDA had their guidance document on the longer end of things, it was a 9-year transition period. I've heard a 3-year transition period. So I think 3 to 5 years is probably what we'd be talking about. But if you think about it, you're developing all new internal processes, educating your laboratory staff on new requirements, and beginning to submit information on your tests. Those 3 to 5 years are going to go pretty quick. So don't be lulled into a sense of complacency by, oh, it's 5 years out, we've got plenty of time. There's a lot to do should FDA begin regulating LDTs. All right, so now what? This is where I pull out my crystal ball and tell you what I think. I will tell you that FDA has been very, very tight-lipped on what these potential regulations might say. There's certainly a lot of rumors swirling, but the fact of the matter is we just don't know how far FDA is going to go. So I do think FDA will publish LDT regulations. Again, we know this to be true now. They are in the final review stage, and I expect them in the next couple of weeks. I suspect there will be a lot of public comments. Certainly individual laboratories will submit comments. Professional societies will absolutely submit comments, and other stakeholders will as well. And then finally, once the finalized regulations are published, that's where the lawyers are going to get involved. And I am quite confident there will be multiple lawsuits challenging FDA's authority to regulate LDTs. I'm not a lawyer, so I have no idea which way those will go. But I think there is a reasonable chance that we will see a greater FDA oversight of our laboratory developed tests. So here's what I expect the regulations to say. Again, this is just my guesswork at this point, but I do think, obviously FDA is going to explicitly say that lab developed tests are medical devices, just like IVDs. I think there's going to have to be some sort of prioritization scheme. Again, FDA doesn't have the resources to review hundreds of thousands of existing tests, so they're going to have to prioritize on certain types of tests. Now, they have signaled what some of those might be. So they've issued safety notices on pharmacogenetics testing, as well as some newborn screening tests. So I think those are things that they'll probably prioritize highly. And I also think some of the more complex technologies like next-gen sequencing, multiplex mass spec, those also would probably be fairly high on the list of tests that FDA would prioritize. One question I have is around good manufacturing practices. So GMP is basically a quality system that FDA expects medical device manufacturers to follow. There's a lot of overlap likely between GMP and your existing quality system. However, GMP involves significantly more documentation. If you think you fill out a lot of forms today, GMP is a whole new world of fun and excitement. So I'm not clear if FDA would require GMP for labs or if they would use some enforcement discretion on that. That's a big open question for me. I would not be surprised if we saw some enforcement action. That is FDA contacting labs that they have tests that the FDA is concerned about to kind of flex their muscle. Again, that's my guesswork, but I would not be surprised if we saw FDA starting to reach out to select laboratories that they have concerns about. So again, because this would be done under their existing resources, I think FDA will have to start small. However, I talked about that FDA funding bill last year. That's on a 5-year cycle. And so that's going to come up again in 2027. So I would fully expect FDA to ask for probably a lot more money. And at that time, we'd probably see an expansion then of what FDA is looking at. They would staff up and look at more tests. So what would FDA regulation mean to our laboratories? I think it would certainly require more resources for your test development, because likely we'd be needing to do more studies. Every time that I've talked to FDA about a test submission, they've wanted more information, more wet lab studies, greater documentation, more detail in our explanations, etc. And so that takes up time. There's also submission fees for the FDA. So for the privilege of submitting your test to the FDA, depending typically on the risk level, you need to pay them a certain amount of money up front. So that's some additional financial outlay that laboratories don't need today. There's also the implementation delay. So today I can develop and validate a test and then immediately offer it to my physicians and my patients. In the future, I need to wait 90 days, maybe more, for FDA to approve that test before I can offer it. So I think ultimately this will lead to some hard decisions. Laboratories that have a small LDT menu may decide that FDA is too much work and they're just going to refer out all of those tests, and they're not going to be developing or running LDTs anymore. Other laboratories that have large LDT menus, I think academic medical centers, for example, typically have pretty large LDT menus, may need to make some hard decisions around what are the platforms or technologies that we use the most, and are there some technologies we don't use very much, and maybe we won't develop on those platforms anymore. Again, we'll send those tests to another laboratory that does have the technology and is submitting to FDA. So I think importantly, we all need to stay engaged. This isn't over, this isn't going away. And if FDA does indeed publish draft regulations, to make sure that we all understand what's in those regulations, that we submit comments or work with professional societies or industry partners to submit comments on those regulations. So I think it's going to be a busy fall, basically. With that, Jenny and I are happy to entertain any questions the group might have. So first question around PAMA. PAMA keeps getting kicked down the road. Are there any signals that it will be permanently shut down? I think the short answer is no. It is true that Congress recognizes that cutting lab reimbursement by 15% is not a good idea, frankly. But doing a permanent fix, like I had mentioned, will cost $2 to $4 billion. And so what they're doing is they keep kicking the can down the road essentially a year at a time. So PAMA is not going anywhere because I think fundamentally PAMA is okay. It's really just the calculations and the math that CMS is using to calculate these reimbursement cuts is the problem. So it's a tricky situation for sure. Basically having these one-year extensions doesn't give labs a lot of comfort, because there could come a year where Congress just doesn't do that and these cuts go into effect. So we really would like a permanent fix. Next question. Sorry, Jenny, these all appear to be kind of FDA related. So for modifications, is a different test container considered a minor modification? So it really depends on the language in the regulations. So in the early version of valid, no, that would not be considered a minor modification. If I am using plasma, for example, and I want to add serum, that would be a modification that would require a submission to the FDA. Under latter versions of valid, that would be considered a minor modification, most likely, and not require submission. So it really depends on how FDA writes those regulations and how strict and stringent they want to be. Modifications is probably one of the areas that I am most concerned about, because again, laboratories, we modify our tests all the time, and for good reason, and we always validate it, but needing to wait for 3 months and submit to the FDA and wait for their approval is certainly not ideal. I think the scenario that I always use as an example is a reagent outage. Manufacturer alerts me that they had a lot failure or something, I can't get the reagent. we'll scramble and try to find a backup reagent and validate it quickly and keep that test up and running. If I need to submit to the FDA to approve that modification of using a different reagent, I'm going to have to take the test down because there's no way I'm going to be able to limp along for 3 months, for example. So modification is definitely something to keep an eye on. And then why does modifying an FDA-approved test default to an LDT high complexity? So expanding use to pediatric populations. Vendors are unable to meet FDA expectations for validation in pediatrics. It is unlikely labs have the resources, and it can be a patient safety issue. Great question. So when a manufacturer submits their IVD test kit to the FDA, they basically say, here is the intended patient population. Here is what the test kit is used for. So what analyte it looks for example. Here are the specimen types we accept. And here are the performance characteristics. So FDA approves that very specific set of criteria. If we change any of those criteria, it is now no longer FDA approved because we're not falling within those very strict bookends, essentially. And so by definition, because we are no longer following the FDA approved package insert instructions, that test is by definition an LDT. And I completely agree with you, that is a huge challenge for laboratories because quite often test kit out of the box doesn't do what we need it to. Maybe we need to expand it to a different patient population, like you say in this example, or maybe we need to expand the stability because the stability is 24 hours and we have a very hard time, getting samples in that period. So we validated a longer stability. Many of those could be considered a modification, pushing that FDA cleared kit into an LDT. So definitely a concern and something that obviously we all live with every single day. So good question.
Shannon, someone asked any word about CLIA personnel updates. And the short answer is no. And actually that's the long answer as well. Nothing has come through. Nothing has come through. I would expect we will hear, it will just show up one day that they have updated and here's the update. So nothing, no updates there.
So Jenny, since we have 2 minutes, is there a resource that you would recommend for folks to kind of stay up on the latest and greatest from CLIA, for example?
There is a listserv coming out from CMS that you can sign up for. I don't know what it is called, how to sign up for it off the top of my head. I've been signed up for years. I have to do some research on how to sign up for that. I think you can just go to cms.gov and the CLIA page and sign up for that. That would be the best way. Yeah, that would be the best way. And also some states have a really, really good CLIA group that does, their state department does have a really good CLIA group that also does do it too. But that's only certain states. Not every state does that. That also has a listserv as well.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, Sarah, I think I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Yep. Sounds good. Thank you, Shannon and Jenny, for a great presentation. And thank you all for participating in today's Continual Improvement webinar. If your question was not addressed during today's session, or if you have additional questions, please include them in the evaluation. You may reference the link in the chat to access the evaluation. Laboratory credit is extended for this program. Upon finalizing your evaluation, you'll have the option to claim credit and print your certificate. If you had registered for this webinar and joined by phone only, please email us at mcleducation@mayo.edu if you do not receive the evaluation. As a reminder, this program was recorded and will be archived on our website in a few weeks. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar.